All right, welcome everybody. We are here for Cassie Hayes' Dissertation Defense. The title of her presentation is "The Data Revolution is Now: How Communication Contributes to Cyber Infrastructure Organizing." Cassie is a PhD candidate in the PhD program in Media and Communication here at Texas Tech University, and she is in her third year in the program. Prior to Texas Tech, Cassie received her MFA in creative writing from the University of Central Arkansas and her BA in English with a minor in creative writing at UT Arlington. And I want to thank Cassie's dissertation committee, Dr. Langford, Dr. Kerber, and Dr. Stoyan for their guidance of Cassie in the graduate program, as well as Dr. Coleman for serving as the graduate dean's rep today to make sure that the defense today follows the guidance and procedures of the graduate school. Quite a few friends of Cassie here at Texas Tech are also here. Thank you for being here. Quite a few members of the cyber infrastructure and RCD community are also here. They were either interviewed by Cassie or they heard about the dissertation project. So thank you for being here. So this is the plan for today. Cassie will give an oral presentation of her dissertation project for about 25 to 30 minutes. After that, the floor is open for questions from the public audience. Around 11 a.m. Central Time, we will assess if there are more questions from the public audience. If not, we will thank them for their engagement and give them a moment to drop off Zoom as the committee and the Dean's Rep transition to the second half of the defense. Then the committee and the Dean's Rep, who have all read Cassie's full dissertation of more than 200 pages, will continue asking Cassie questions about her work. When the questions come to a natural pause during the second half, Cassie will be placed in the Zoom waiting room while the committee will deliberate on their decision. Once the decision has been reached, Cassie will come back to the main meeting room and the decision will be announced at that point. Shortly after the defense officially concludes, the decision about her dissertation will be made public. The first half of the Zoom defense will be recorded. It's actually being recorded right now, and it will be posted for others from the public who would like to learn more about Cassie's research. The second half of the defense will not be recorded. So with that, Cassie, are you ready? All right, take it away.
Ready to go. Okay, cool. So let me pull up my slide deck here. All right, so as Dr. Key mentioned, I'm trying to get the Zoom thing out of the way. As Dr. Key mentioned, this project is entitled "The Data Revolution is Now: How Communication Contributes to Cyber Infrastructure Organizing." So what is CI, cyber infrastructure, as I look at it in this study? Advanced CI is the network of supercomputers and professionals in the United States dedicated to enabling the use of big data for research. The story of CI can be described as originating with the various experiments in grid computing, connecting computers to allow for more access and capabilities. 1985 marked a key turning point in the system with the establishment of the internet, upon which advanced CI relies, and the NSF Centers program, which established those original supercomputing centers in the United States. The organizing of a blue panel report called the Atkins Report in 2003 first launched the specific concept of CI, which has become further immersed in the NSF vision and STEM initiatives in the US in the years since. Although CI involves a variety of those fancy large-scale technologies, a central layer of the system includes the humans who support, develop, and maintain it, what Lee et al. Termed the human infrastructure of CI. Without this human layer that comes together to support the system, the technical capabilities of CI would not function, and would not be accessible to the researchers who need them to do their work. So with this study, my main point, I wanted to focus on that human layer of CI. Specifically, I aim to ensure CI sustainability through examining the different communicative practices that bring the supporting community together. And why is that important? This human focus on CI and making sure the system's sustainable. Well, CI specifically faces some community growth challenges at the moment, such as an aging workforce and difficulty recruiting new workers to the field. And that challenge and facing that challenge is important to knowledge development and innovation, and by extension, economic development in the US, since CI forms the hidden layer enabling groundbreaking scientific discoveries, such as the COVID vaccine, climate change simulations, and visualizations that help predict, for instance, weather events. Further, all that cool, necessary stuff doesn't happen without communication, which undergirds the entire system of infrastructures. Communication is central to how infrastructures work, as well as perpetuating the ideologies that influence their development. And finally, examining infrastructures, especially their human dimension, can save or cost lives. In my dissertation, I actually give the example of the Texas power grid failure during a winter storm in February of 2021. During that infrastructure failure, 10 million people lost power for several days, causing $130 billion in economic losses in the state and over 200 deaths. Meanwhile, in the response, the dysfunction of ERCOT, the organization responsible for the Texas grid, was kind of on full display. We have to give attention to the organizational communication dimension of infrastructures, a key element of the functioning and sustainability of these critical systems. And you don't have to trust me on how important infrastructures are right now. Instead, trust President Biden, who said in his recent State of the Union address that we're now talking about an infrastructure decade. As can be seen in political debates over infrastructure right now, regarding both the agendas of President Biden and former President Trump, how digital technologies fit into conceptualizations and priorities with infrastructure is a highly relevant issue as we move further into the 21st century. So with this study broadly, I ask, how do the organizations that support infrastructure such as CI form and stay together? And to tackle this question, I rely on three main threads of past literature. First, the CI community is a self-organizing community. Although influenced by institutional pressures, the community is driven by the members themselves without a formal hierarchical structure. Contractors stated that self-organizing systems theory involves seeking to explain the emergence of pattern behavior in systems that are initially in a state of disorganization. And self-organizing can probably be visualized best with non-human examples. Think of bees swarming together, which that picture kind of creeps me out. So sorry if it creeps you guys out. Or a herd of cattle kind of standing together in a field. Self-organizing occurs when, for one reason or another, people decide to come together on their own. Secondly, I pull from past work on mythic criticism and the importance of stories to organizing. Myths specifically, as defined by rhetorical scholar Rowland, involve larger than life tales of heroic origins and sacred quests, justifying present action through the conjuring of narratives set in a distant kind of fantasy past. Further, these narratives play a key role in identity, offering the reasons for a culture being distinct and established in the first place. And really, myths, as I examine them here, can be best thought of as creation stories, like this Iroquois creation story depicted here. And finally, I use diffusion of innovations literature to further examine the development and spread of the infrastructure system of CI. Diffusion guru Rogers defined diffusion as the process in which an innovation or a new idea, behavior, or technology is communicated through certain channels over time among the members of a social system. And importantly, diffusion scholarship encompasses development of innovations as well as that spread, as the two processes are really blurred. And diffusion scholarship also includes dissemination efforts. So rather than that organic spread only, also the active push of an innovation using diffusion principles. From those three threads of past literature, I formed my three specific research questions for this project. So first, what communicative mechanisms are at work within the CI community that drive its distinctive self-organizing process? Second, how do infrastructure myths shape the CI community in ways that rhetorically perpetuate a technocratic version of American identity? And finally, what communication strategies could aid in the sustainable dissemination of CI in the future? And to tackle these questions, I took a mixed methods approach to ensure I captured all the angles of the CI organizing process. Specifically, I carried out a rhetorical analysis and qualitative interviews, a mixed methods approach influenced by rhetorical fieldwork. This approach was essential to my project. Without a rhetorical focus, I would have missed the implications of that foundational myth that arguments for CI rely upon. Without qualitative interviews, I would have missed how communication works in this community actually in practice, and the perceptions of CI professionals that give CI organizing its overall meaning. So for the rhetorical analysis, I analyzed 31 NSF-associated reports on CI and CI-like precursor initiatives, as well as the NSF's budget requests to Congress from 2002 to 2022. And I analyzed those budget requests too, because CI, due to a large-scale ambitious nature, requires federal funding in the form of grants to operate. And I didn't go into the artifacts, specifically looking for myth at first, but as I started to read through these documents, I began noticing repeated reliance on mythic elements to argue for CI. For the qualitative interviews, I carried out 20 interviews via Zoom with CI professionals in a variety of roles from January to March 2022. All these were recruited through PERC 20, a conference important in the community, or through snowball recruitment strategy. In addition, I analyzed 20 transcripts previously conducted for another project from 2016 to 2019, but which also had insights into this community. And I included those extra interviews as well, mostly to make sure that COVID's impacts weren't skewing my findings. Finally, I took a grounded theory approach to the analysis of these, so letting the data kind of speak for itself as I develop themes pointing to that overarching concept. And what I found with all that analysis is that CI relies on foundational myths and communication streams to organize communities of professionals that support the technological system. Specifically, I outline the rhetoric, rituals, and riots that enable CI organizing. With rhetoric, I argue that a distinct American infrastructure myth works to justify arguments for digital technologies, such as CI. This myth builds off past stories of frontiers and industrialization to offer romanticized origins for a technocratic logic that pervades modern American identity. With rituals, I find that repetition provided by ritual communicative practices allows for stability and security within the community, a reinforcing of established professional identity and a shared sense of meaning. And with riots, I find that riot communicative practices allow the technologies and community to remain a perpetual revolution, always ahead of technological and societal advances, always pushing to reach more users and be more accessible. So regarding rhetoric and this American infrastructure myth, CI arguments tell a story, and a very specific type of story, a mythic creation narrative that solves symbolic problems, defines a good society, and constitutes an identity. For instance, this is the very first paragraph of the Atkins report, which is that foundational document that launched the official concept of CI. Stories are defined by characters, a setting, and action that's usually centered around seeking solutions to problems. The characters in the infrastructure myths that CI relies upon include scientists and engineers that gift humanity the means of modernity. As you see here, the Atkins report sets the stage for this narrative. As computational technology advances, enable a revolution that increasingly undergirds our modern world. Further, mythic hero characters aren't everyday people. Rather, they are near deities with spectacular superhuman powers. With the infrastructure myths of CI rhetoric, scientists and engineers are able to foresee the future, making predictions about what technologies humanity will need in the years to come. Here, the Atkins report mentions extraordinary promise and further transformation that's going to come in the future. Finally, these heroic characters are also technocratic in spirit. And I'm using technocratic here as the idea that experts should be in control and lead society, and places a sacred responsibility on those technocratic experts to act in socially beneficial, progressive ways. Here and throughout the Atkins report, authors mention a responsibility to develop CI to benefit humanity. And precursors to what became CI also include the beginnings of such mythic lingo. So this was actually the passage where in my analysis, I started thinking maybe something mythic might be going on with CI rhetoric. So here, the authors discuss computer science network by outlining a set of standards for the network. They use a lot of should and must type statements that read like a series of values. And in fact, when I was reading this initially, it reminded me of reading something like a foundational document like the Constitution, sort of giving an outline of how a speculative society should function based on important ethical values and identity markers. And looking further at this passage, you can start to see those values appear, which all point to infrastructure as the main ideology. These statements talk about large ranges of networks that include communities and multiple harmonious components. Further, identity is important in the standards of this network. The authors discuss defining boundaries and who can do what in this system. And finally, specific use of infrastructure imagery also appears throughout the reports I analyzed, communicating symbolic modernity, domination of the so-called frontiers of knowledge, and at times even American nationalistic concepts such as the American dream and being a city on the hill are an example to other nations. So here's an example of an image used in a few of the reports, this illustrated bridge. The city pictured above is Königsberg in Russia. A logical math problem includes figuring out how to walk through the city, crossing each of these bridges right here only once. This image, the illustrated bridge and the mathematical problem city, showcase the vision of CI. CI undergirds and supports modern solutions to help people get intellectually where they need to be. So rhetoric forms the foundation of CI organizing. As the myths of infrastructure in CI give the community a sense of identity and purpose. Now I'm going to move into the more in-practice aspects of communication within CI. So first, rituals are repeated interactions that keep the community forming with a stable sense of duty and identity. I identify 5 ritual communicative practices in the community, as you can see listed here. So starting with translating, a central work task of CI professionals includes translating new and complex computational methods and the related complex technological system to new users and other stakeholders. Collaborating is another key and routine act in the community, a reason people reach out to other community members. These CI systems rely on grant funding and focus on interdisciplinary problems. So CI professionals have to collaborate to both get those grants and have the different areas of expertise needed to tackle those really ambitious, big problems. Sharing spaces relates to the physical spaces necessary for CI organizing, both the locations on campuses and the in-person conferences that provide camaraderie and personal support for professionals. Interpreting guidance goes back to funding agencies, universities, and the other layers of institutions that influence CI. Professionals must always be interpreting and enacting those layers of guidance and come together to figure out what they need to do to implement such policies and pressures. And finally, CI professionals constantly have to justify their existence as a distinct area. CI depends on a lot of federal funding. It's large scale, it's long term. So it's an investment not made lightly. Further, CI is often hidden by nature, elusive to understand by outsiders. So professionals constantly must articulate why what CI does is necessary and different from other solutions. For instance, commercial cloud resources or something like that. And here's an example of the translating ritual. Translators often act as a hidden layer of understanding, knowing that others will receive attention for the noteworthy work that they make possible. And this professional said, the CI community, it's a community that is content with being a tool in the process, not the focus of the press or anything like that. No one gets a Nobel Prize for setting up cyber infrastructure, but every Nobel researcher is using that cyber infrastructure. And so this professional goes on to say, it's a community that's okay with that. And further, here's an example of the importance of sharing spaces, so physical and material spaces. This professional mused on the ephemeral danger with digital technologies. So this person said there's a real danger in things becoming more and more ephemeral. What's an archaeologist going to find? We find stuff from thousands of years ago. What are they going to find from this year? And I feel like I really love this passage because I feel like it gets not only at that sharing spaces type ritual, but also the fact that CI as an ideology, as a vision, really focuses broadly on culture and cultural impact as well. The definition of an identity, as well as just enabling further research. In addition to those rituals, another more in-practice stream of communication included Riot communicative practices. Importantly, despite the term riot, these aren't destructive. Rather, they're constructive, though maybe disruptive at times. Noteworthy instances of communication that push the community to adapt. A key dimension of self-organizing systems includes this ability to adapt, as they must pivot on their own to changing circumstances. So just briefly, I'll go through each of these here. Contradicting rituals involve when those rituals I identified a minute ago clash for one reason or another. So for instance, what if interpreting guidance causes disruption with justifying, for instance, for a certain campus? Competing involves when professionals must battle each other for the limited resources and funding available, thus causing them to adapt to remain cutting edge. Many professionals that I talked to mentioned co-opetition as a defining part of the community, in which collaborators often also compete simultaneously with each other. And in fact, even sometimes when competitors are helping each other with their competing projects. Evangelizing involves outreach, trying to get new members of the community and immerse them in the CI worldview. Questioning happens at points of failure within the community. Criticisms or limits, such as technical limits and capabilities, or social criticisms about who is actually welcomed in the community, can cause professionals to question their beliefs and adapt. And finally, listening is a key communicative act in which professionals show receptivity to absorb changes in circumstances and user needs. So here, a professional brings up another angle of competing. So not only among individual professionals themselves, but also more broadly among institutions and states. So this person even tied the developments of CI, adaptations within the community, to presidential administrations, stating administrations choose things to emphasize that they think the US economy might be uniquely competitive for. Another professional gave the metaphor of being an Uber driver and driving a car to explain listening to user needs and adapting. This professional describes picking up these different sizes of data, saying we built a car, but now people want it to be a bus. So we had to make it a van. They had to adapt and compromise. And rhetoric, rituals, and riots of CI organizing have many implications for both organizational communication scholarship and more broadly society today, especially as we move into this infrastructure decade that President Biden proclaimed. This project showcases that communication plays a key role in all mechanisms of CI organizing. Previous self-organizing scholars have noted mechanisms such as self-interest, receptivity, and uncertainty at driving organizing. This project's findings emphasize that none of those mechanisms would work without related streams of communication enabling them. Further, my project adds to organizational communication scholarship on the communicative constitution of organizations. I find that the CI community is made up of communication at various levels, which keeps this very dispersed community together. And I also attempt to outline the role of communication to infrastructure systems, as explained at the very beginning of this presentation. I articulate an American infrastructure myth that may be used in other contexts to make arguments for initiatives and technologies, similar to the frontier myth that we actually use in science discourse all the time. Finally, I contribute to work on diffusion, exploring rhetoric in the key persuasion step of the diffusion process, and exploring that blurred development part of diffusion. And finally, there's several practical implications that also come from this project. Also, as alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, including the resilience of our critical public infrastructures, boosting CI community workforce development, and contributing to insight in science and technology policy in general. And the big takeaway of this project involves development of an interpretive framework for studying communication in infrastructure organizing. And I kind of visualize this as a house that's kind of being constructed, as you can see pictured there, with rhetoric as the foundation, rituals as the walls and roof, and riots as the doors and windows. So rhetoric gives an infrastructure its ideological underpinnings, its sense of purpose and symbolic urgency, articulating its vision and who can be a part of that vision. Rituals help uphold the structure, giving shape and definition to the community, so a sense of order. And riots open up the community to adaptation, rearranging the figurative space of the community as needed to keep the system usable and accessible. Infrastructures need all three communication forces to be effective and sustainable, though much more work is needed to see how these forces look in different contexts beyond CI. So to summarize what I did with my RQs, in this project, I wanted to know how the organizations that support infrastructure such as CI form and stay together, finding that communication undergirds this entire process. Regarding communicative mechanisms influencing community organizing, I identified ritual and riot communicative practices, routine communication acts that provide stability and distinction for the community, and disruptive communication acts that pressure the community to adapt. And I really think rhetoric kind of falls under that first RQ as well overall. Regarding infrastructure myths, I find that myths play a foundational role in the community, granting CI professionals a sense of unique purpose in their work. And finally, to ensure that the community remains sustainable in the long term, further cultivation and acknowledgement of the rhetoric, rituals, and riots of CI organizing is necessary. And I also note in my dissertation 5 specific strategies for CI sustainability that were really informed by my conversations with CI professionals, including showcasing CI as a career, preserving the materiality of the infrastructure, enabling secure and integrity-bound behavior, cultivating various levels of expertise, and embracing infrastructure as an ideology. Such strategies could help ensure that this necessary and exciting innovation remains viable for the foreseeable future. So that's all the content I have, but before I end, I want to kind of echo Dr. Key and really give a thanks here for my committee and my dean's representative here today. Thanks so much, all of you, for your support, encouragement, and knowledge throughout this process. I really couldn't have carried this out without you guys' guidance, and I couldn't have developed into the scholar I am without your guidance. So I've been so fortunate here at Texas Tech to be able to work with such smart and supportive people. And so that's all I have. That is the thing. And I do have references if you were wondering anything about that. I'll just go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you, Cassie, for a wonderful presentation. And now the floor is open for questions. Questions or comments?
I'll be glad to start with my questions, if that's okay.
Please.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, excellent work, Cassie. I enjoyed reading it and I enjoyed hearing your presentation. I have, I guess one just kind of, and this is a really open-ended question, that just something I was thinking about. You talk a lot about the word infrastructure, and that seems to be a really important concept and term in all of this. But I also noticed in a lot of the texts, and especially in the interviews, the word data comes up a lot. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts or insights of kind of how people are defining data when it's research participants, but also kind of the larger significance. I mean, since this is essentially a rhetorical analysis, the role that that plays in the context of this larger concept of infrastructure.
Mhm. I think that's a great question. And as far as like how the people I talk to define it, it's kind of interesting because they often like some of them started the origins of CI even way beyond like computational data. So instead of like computational data, they're thinking of data as just streams of communication and information that's kind of passing from one person to another. It's like one person went all the way back to like cave paintings. So we're trying to transfer our experiences, which I thought was interesting to think about data transfer in this way. So I would say as far as like that theme is there for sure. Big data is a key part of the vision of CI. But I don't think it's just computational data. I think it's big data in the sense of information that's vast being shared and transferred between units. Does that kind of answer your question?
Oh yeah, it does. Yeah, and like I said, this was meant as a very open-ended question. I mean, it struck me, I think, in that one of those quotes you shared towards the end of your presentation, talking about Uber, if I was understanding correctly, the participant was actually defining human users as data, or they were referring to data in a way that sort of conflated it with the people who request rides on Uber. Was that, did I?
Yeah, I would say that the boundary is very blurred between humans and data in this system. And that's just because I think going back to that definition, it's not just computational data that they worry about. It's information transfer on a large scale.
Okay, so it would be correct for me to say that, yes, data takes on a much larger meaning than we might typically ascribe to data, right? Because data has a very specific, I guess, dictionary definition. But
yeah,
it's in a lot of different ways that make it a very slippery, a much larger concept.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Another person who actually had a really unique view on things talked about visualizing data as like sculpting earth material, like forming clay with your hands. That's what he does with data. So I would say that data in this community is not like stuff you put into SPSS or something like that. It's very broad, at least as I understand it and as I engaged with the professionals.
Okay. Well, I'll let other people ask questions because I'm sure we have other people who want to ask questions as well, but thank you.
I think my question maybe leapfrogs from that is that, and I don't know, well, this isn't really a question. So actually I would like to ask, were you a debater?
No,
okay,
no, I was shy nerd who read.
You can debate. So one thing that you do is you kind of make a claim, right? And then you provide your evidence and then you move on. And that's actually a debater strategy. So you're using the strategies. And so I want you, like, you have these block quotes and then you move on, right? And I want you to unpack those. And I think that kind of leads from Dr. Kerber's, right? Kind of asking about that is, I want you to dig into those quotes because you could just kind of like, you make a point, you got to put this block quote. Anyway, I've said it and you move on. And so I want you to actually unpack that quote and tell me more about it. What's the significance? What does it mean? That kind of thing before you move on. So that's kind of one thing. And then in addition to do a little more in the way of kind of previewing and summarizing right? Just as kind of working through, I think it's all there. It's just, I just want kind of a little bit more guided, which though you're such an engaging writer, right? I mean, this was so readable and such a clean draft. So that's excellent too, by the way. How did you come up with, and you kind of, how did you come up with rituals and riots? Because you even say like riots aren't kind of destructive. So how did you kind of hit on those as terms?
I mean, I was kind of just trying to capture the idea of you have something regular and routine you do, and then there's a reason you need to adapt. And I wanted to, with the adaption one, get at the kind of grassroots idea of the community. So the grassroots community kind of coming together to kind of protest, though not in a destructive way, together. So I thought riots would kind of capture that. It's like a chaotic thing that's also kind of organized and large scale and pushes for change of some kind. We're not going to stand for just the status quo anymore. We're going to do something else. So I really liked that with the term. I also wanted an R so I could like pull everything together. So I was like, maybe routines. I really like rituals because the sacred feel of a ritual. You sit down, you do your same thing every day because it gives meaning and stability to your identity in your life. And then I wanted an R word that captured that protest advocacy sort of angle. So I was like, riots might work. So I have to clarify that they're not like burning stuff.
I might include a little bit more about that in your narrative. At first, you know, when you start talking, I thought maybe a footnote, but, you know, I once had the advice of put it up or out, right? And so take whatever those, if you have a substantive note. So maybe I might include kind of a short, brief kind of selection, not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily say you wanted 3 R's, right?
Well, yeah.
But I think your justification is excellent for why you chose. In particular, it was the riot for me that, you know, the ritual I kind of got more, right? And I don't know if anybody else wants to ask. I've got more questions, but I'm so happy for other people to ask questions and to mix it up. I'll ask another one then. If you think, feel free to jump in. I want more with myth.
Okay.
And really that's the thing, is like, you've done such a great job. I just want more, right? And part of me was thinking, although I think that in a way kind of myth and narrative are kind of merging in my head, right? But it's almost in a way that you speak about myth in a very narrative way. And so, and myths are, right, narrative. So I was kind of, I would like more about like, who are the agents? You kind of point to agents at times within the CI community. I want to know more specifically who these agents are. And then, because I feel like there's an identity construction, right, that occurs in this. And so I want to know what that identity construction is. I had a thought, but it kind of left me. And then kind of what's the conflict? So is the conflict technological dominance? Is the conflict to be a good example for other nation states? Like, what is that conflict that this myth kind of addresses? Or a need that the myth kind of addresses?
Are you like asking, or are you saying include that?
Well, it could just be something to think about, you know.
Yeah, I think I do need to clarify that, because I think I have too much going on with what the conflict could be. So I just need to clarify it. Because I would say it might not even be just tech dominance or nation states competing or performing their statehood or whatever. I would say it's also maybe conquering those frontiers of knowledge, like braving the boundaries of what we know. And I would say that's not clear in the draft for sure.
So is this, you say it's an origin myth, but is it really just another type of frontier myth?
I debated that a lot. So I debated whether this was separate from frontier myth for technology, or if this was like a type that falls under frontier myth for technology. And I'm not completely sure because frontier myths don't need like machinery and technology. They don't talk about industrialization. And a key dimension of infrastructure myth is industrialization and machinery dominance. But I think an argument could be made that this is falling under that scope.
Well, you have the myth of the final frontier, right? Of space.
Yeah.
And it needs that technology. It might not talk about that technology because the myth isn't the technology, right?
Right. I don't know. I went back and forth with whether this was underneath or separate. And ultimately I made it separate because I felt like that industrial dimension of the machinery being important was different from a frontier myth that focuses on wilderness. But there's definitely a symbiotic type of relationship between those different or fairly similar myths.
Well, and I'll say I bought your argument, right? Like I totally did. It totally is persuasive to me when you're talking because, then I was thinking about Michael Left and thinking about time, right? Because when you're talking about that origin time, there's something important to returning to that point of origin, right? That performs, particularly because you're framing this as a US nation state myth, right? And so that point of origin always is significant in our mythic construction, right? And so I totally bought into it. It was just it's a little slippery, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But maybe this myth combines elements of the two.
That's true. I mean, they're definitely not completely distinct, separate. There's definitely feeding off each other. I wasn't sure with that whether that feeding off was like equal level or like underneath sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. On page 75, you say rhetoric cannot remain analytical study of a rhetorical situation, and your quote's a little longer. Why not? And I know you're referencing bats, right? And then you bring in Biesecker, but why not?
Let me find that passage.
Page 75.
So rhetoric cannot remain the analytical study of it.
Yeah, it's the start of the last paragraph on that page.
Oh yeah, I think I was just saying that rhetoric isn't just seeing what's there, basically. It's reading between the lines a little bit, and it's not just analytical, it's also effective and how something moves you. However, if I need to articulate that better, I definitely
I think so, because there's a lot of people who talk about rhetoric as affect.
Yeah.
Right. And so that just, and part of me then wondered, well, what is exactly rhetoric? That made me question that. And so that had a little slippage for me too, just the sentence. And then, I think I know where you're going because you're engaging really in Vatz's critique of Bitzer, right? And you're bringing in Biesecker's critique as well. And they have very valid critiques, right? But that just kind of, in a way too, I think this is where I was going earlier, throughout your document, you frequently give rhetoric agency. And rhetoric doesn't have its own agency, right? It's people, it's institutions using rhetoric. And so I think that that's part of the slippage maybe that I pick up here too.
Okay.
And so, and I'll send you a marked up draft that I've got these kind of,
yes, that would be very appreciated.
Yeah, I've got a marked
all
draft.
Changes. Yeah.
But once again, all of these are minor, I mean, relatively minor things. And it's just that you've done such a great job. I just want more. So my final question that I like to ask is, what do you want to do with this project? Where do you want it to go? How are you thinking about kind of in an academic sense using it or not?
Yeah.
A non-academic.
So I'm definitely going to use it. I spent time and tears on this project. I will use it. But my plan is to break up the more easy to break up sections and make those into papers for conferences and publications. I want to do more interviews. I wrapped those up pretty quick to get the dissertation over with, but I want to do more of my own interviews and turn that into more papers. I didn't get to hit on Dr. Stoyan, the institutional angle that I'm just so interested in, and I see it in my transcripts. So I also want to do a paper on that angle. And overall, once I'm doing all that paper, I also am trying to turn it into a book. So I do want to turn it into like a book one day, probably like maybe like a science and technology studies audience type book for infrastructure studies.
I definitely read it like a book, you know, and of course you can, it is kosher for you to publish chapters or essentially publish articles and then have those articles be chapters. So working in that direction, that's totally kosher. And I really like the phrase that I kind of want you to play more on, the wondrous long now. I thought that's the book title for me. So I think that's
titles.
Yeah, I think that's great. Good. So that's kind of, you know, I'm hoping I was reading this thinking ultimately book project. So,
yeah,
well, I'll be done with questions.
Can I just chime in, because while Dr. Langford was talking, I thought of a couple of things that I had also jotted down. So I really like her question about the myth and sort of maybe spelling that out a little more concretely, putting a little more, I don't know, human side of it, a human side to it. And I think this observation is connected. When I was reading through your interviews, I thought these quotes are great. These are such compelling narratives. I'd like to know a little bit more about the people. And I know you have the big table at the back and an appendix, and it gives some very brief demographic data. And maybe that's all the demographic data you have, but I don't know. I just felt like when I was reading the interviews, when I was reading your analysis of the interviews, I would like to know this is an individual person talking and this is where they come from. Because, and even though you present this as two different methods, the rhetorical analysis and the interviews, I mean, really they're interconnected, right? And I mean, the people you're interviewing, they're the same kind of people that write these documents, right? Whether or not they are the exact authors, it's the same.
At times they were the same people. Yeah.
Okay. And that's what I thought. So I don't know, maybe there's a way to meld that together a little bit more, but also put more flesh on the bones of the people. And by doing that, it also might, in a roundabout way, contribute to addressing Dr. Langford's question about sort of who are the, I think what you said, Katie, was who are the agents in this myth?
But I think that for me, that question is their discourse creates an agent. Although I totally agree with you, it's not necessarily the specific person though.
Right. I mean, there's different ways to go about this. I guess, and maybe I'm seeing connections where connections don't exist, but I guess I would like to see the participants more as humans. And I think in an indirect way, that also might give more liveliness to the myth idea. That this myth originates, or this myth exists because humans perpetuate it and believe in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, but anyway, I also made comments that the same passage that Dr. Langford comment on about rhetoric and what rhetoric is, I also made comments.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and just one little thing. I noticed in some place VATS is spelled VATS and it should be VATZ.
Oh, really? Okay. I'll definitely fix that.
But that's it. I'm ready for other people to ask questions.
Hey, Cassie. So you spun together this great, you wove together this great story through this, and it's sounds really almost romantic and glamorous, right? This set of characters. And I'm just wondering if the people you talk to, if you sensed that they perceived themselves as characters in this big story, so to speak.
I mean, I feel like the people I talk to, I mean, they feel like they're doing something important. And so they have this sense of importance and purpose and mission with what they're doing. That's why they do what they do. So I wouldn't say they're like, I am a character in this plot. They probably aren't thinking of that, but they do know that they have this important role to play in whatever's happening here with CI. So I would say that the community is kind of, it knows that it's doing something that's needed. And that needed feeling, I interpret, comes from that myth that they kind of perpetuate to keep having that sense of meaning. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wondered if you had the sense from people that they, both that importance and their role in this bigger saga, so to speak. And then my other question is, if you talked to anyone who had ever worked outside of the US in the infrastructure.
So I focused on US in my study, though I did end up interviewing, I think, 2 people who first were in Europe. So those people kind of were able to compare and contrast the systems, which was kind of interesting and would have been a good new study, comparing and contrasting those systems. And they also had unique stuff to talk about with difficulties / opportunities of collaborating with with international people. So although I focused on people in the US for this, just because I wanted to focus on that nationalistic context, I mean, these people are moving all around. So I did get a little bit of that hint there.
Okay, thanks. Great job.
Yeah, thanks for being here today too.
Please ask more questions or share some comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I don't necessarily have questions, and I think Dr. Langford and Dr. Korber kind of like asked away my only questions that I had, but I just wanted to congratulate you on this whole dissertation. That's definitely no easy feat. I mean, you have 2 amazing methods, but also 2 time-consuming methods, looking at the rhetorical elements and doing interviews. And I found your insights and your findings fascinating. I agree that I think you can put it all in a book easily. I think it's going to depend on kind of your future trajectory and the job you get and, you know, their requirements for articles versus books. But I was fascinated by it. And I did have the same question about, you know, rituals and riots and myths. And I think if you can explain those more, you know, in your book or articles, I think there's definitely going to kind of like put it all in a circle of like, why is this important and how did we refer to this? Because at some point I actually thought that maybe some of these came from the interviews themselves. And so like, I actually learned a lot by hearing you explain how you figured out rituals versus riots, and especially riots. That's the one that caught my eyes as well. So congrats on this.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, I definitely need to clarify that in the thing. Why riots, especially?
Patrick, do you have something to share?
Yeah, first, thanks very much for this. It sounded very, very interesting. And I have to say, I look forward to the book. A number of us on the call are involved in some professional organizations around the people involved in this stuff. And many of us are actually exploring the idea of professionalizing as a means of improving our situation. And some have, when we've had these discussions about this, some have compared this to the process of the evolution of guilds, which also share the rhetoric and ritual aspects of the model you described, but they have as their end goal more exclusion and controlled access to membership, where we've been at pains to emphasize that we're not interested in control or exclusion. And the Riot aspect of what you described really resonates with me. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit about, sort of the difference of these folks from some of the other professional societies that have that more control aspect.
So I love this question because this is part of what I love about this community. Like, I know basically nothing about computers, and somehow I got these people to just chat with me about this. They're so open with the community. Like, sure, just show up and we'll welcome you in. So that is definitely different from a lot of professional organizations, which does focus on exclusion, because the entire point in their mind is to keep people out and make this special thing. So I personally think that goes a little bit back to the infrastructure type ideal and as an ideology of the community. So this community really values everyday people being able to access the system. And that's like the entire point of the vision. So I think that's kind of part of it. A lot of the professionals also brought up that there's kind of organically just really nice people in this community, that it's not like most other technological type professional communities where there's a lot of, what, you don't know this random niche thing? Well, you're out, you're stupid, you should go. It's just not like that. So I think that distinction marker also helps the CI community kind of say why they're unique. So they're real proud of that sort of marker. And that's another way that the profession forms, I think, because it's a boundary between other professions. Like, we're not mean, we do this way, we're open access sort of thing. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been interesting, as I say, we find ourselves often at pains to make that distinction when we're talking to people. I look forward to talking to you more about this, because I think one of the things we're all struggling with is how do we make more effective use of communication in making our case. So
yeah, it's hard to describe cyber infrastructure, as I know from trying to explain what my dissertation is about to like my parents, who are like, so it's cybersecurity? I don't know what you're talking about. But yeah, and I think communication can help with that and show the exciting parts of this community that really needs to exist.
If I can ask another question,
Sure.
How did you come up with your recommendations?
So the recommendations were mostly from professionals themselves. I kind of wanted to showcase like stuff they repeated. So I could kind of share the wealth of what I was getting from these interviews and have a real practical outcome for community members, because I do want to share my findings with participants later. So that's how I came up with the like specific recommendations, mostly repeated stuff within both the interviews and also some recommendations that were repeated in all these different reports from these same people, pretty much.
I might clarify that, because I saw that kind of beyond the scope of kind of the other focus of, or the focus of the rest of your dissertation. So I think that's wonderful. I do think that's wonderful, but I was kind of like, what is this? Is this Cassie just kind of making this up? Or,
Making up what you should do. Okay, yeah, I can clarify that for sure.
I just drop in chat that I'm just enjoying the discussion, and the questions and comments are so great. So I would like to just extend a little bit more the part one of this defense, and to allow more questions. But of course, I know that if some people may need to drop off, if that's the case, I'll make sure to share the recording later on for the first half. So please continue asking questions and sharing comments.
So I've got another one, if you'll forgive me. You mentioned a kind of ethos of people being willing to work in the background and not having to have the limelight, which I think makes sense for a lot of folks. But I also know that my sense is, and this is something I want you to comment on, that another sort of organizing principle among a lot of the people is the sense of being underappreciated. And sometimes people talk about a campus caste system where researchers are seen and see themselves as more important than some of the folks who are doing all the infrastructure and things like that. And I'm wondering, if you saw evidence of that or what your sense is of that in terms of an important factor, almost in the myth, I'm not exactly sure, part of the rhetoric model in terms of how we come together and see ourselves as a community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question also has a big tie to how the profession is developing and that sense of importance that people give a profession. Professionals did bring up with not bitterness, but with a little bit of, that's not great. The distinction on college campuses between like a faculty level person and a staff level person, because staff level people might be doing these groundbreaking stuff to like enable the faculty to do their stuff. They get all this great attention for and tenure for, but the staff level person, doesn't get that level of prestige, I guess. They don't get tenure. And sometimes if you're just developing cyber infrastructure, it's a little bit harder even to get publications out of that because it's just back end stuff that's kind of hidden. So I would say that's part of the reason why one of those recommendations that I offered was showcasing the career, showing the important work that they do to enable things, even if the work itself is a little bit hidden. Because I do think it's important as this becomes like a profession, that it kind of needs to be this legitimized, prestigious thing to showcase that there is really important groundbreaking stuff happening for these people who are doing this important groundbreaking stuff. So, I mean, does that answer your question a little bit?
Everything you said resonates so much. It's some of the case we've been making. And a little bit of it as well is just that as the technology gets more and more complex, it becomes increasingly difficult for the faculty researchers to do it without partnership on that technologist side. And I think, coming to grips with that, everybody coming to grips with that and understanding what co-creation means in that sense.
Yeah. And I really enjoyed, I didn't even know this existed, but there's like initiatives to get people citations for like software and stuff they develop, which a few of my participants brought up. And I think that's great too, because it gives that prestige and a little bit of an acknowledgement that these people are doing really cutting edge stuff, like is cutting edge is the research itself. So yeah.
More questions, comments? It sounds like we have arrived at a natural pause. Shall we transition at this point? So thank you very much. Thank you everybody for attending and attending the first part of the presentation and asking very good questions and sharing very good insights with Cassie for her dissertation. At this point, I will allow a moment for members from the public to drop off from Zoom, and the committee and the Dean's Rep will transition for part two.
Thank you, Cassie.
Great job, Cassie.
Thank you. Great and fascinating work. Bye.
All right. So I'm going to stop the recording right now. Okay. Let's see. Do you want to stop recording?